Zoom into Facebook Live. That's pretty technologically impressive.
Right? So yeah, what you do is there's a button right on Zoom
that takes you in.
Yeah, so
wow.
I had to learn how to do it.
They must have had you and I in mind.
Exactly, right? Exactly.
Yeah, Satyen and Alan will be using it. We probably ought to put a button up here.
Exactly. Okay, hold on one sec. Live with Shelton. Uno momento.
Is it cold there?
No, it's just today was, it's a little cooler than yesterday, but it's actually quite perfect.
Yeah, we're going into the warm, we're headed into warm. So I keep talking to people that have, hoods and long sleeves, and I'm over here going, it's 8 a.m. and I'm starting to sweat.
But we are live. So let me introduce everyone. Welcome. And I have the pleasure to share with you my really good friend, brother, spiritual guide, mentor to CEOs, corporations. You've had such an eclectic career. And every time I chat with you, I'm enlivened, my spirits are awakened, I'm laughing. And I'm also, every time I'm with you, we penetrate the veils of ordinary reality and we end up in the macro space where all of this is arising. And so I just wanted to welcome you. Thank you for being here, brother. And we're in interesting times, but I'd love to hear if you can just share with our folks here just a little bit about your background, and then let's dive in.
Sure. My story identity. I'm a Southern California kid. Grew up in the Orange Groves, kind of a clod kicker, if you will, and got lucky and had a bit of an entrepreneurial piece to me. So I did things as a kid, like shot mistletoe out of trees and put it in bags and sold it to folks and things like that. And so my family thought that maybe I ought to have a real education. So I got sent off to college and got a degree in business. And it turned out that was a really great place for me to live. So I had a meteoric corporate career in my early days. And I was about 12 or 13 years into that, and young, fair-haired, quoted in the Wall Street Journal kind of kid, and there came a moment where none of it made sense, and I was miserable inside, and I think it had to do with having checked all the boxes, and having done that with some expectation that was meaningful in some way, and finding out that it really wasn't, was a real stop in my life. It was probably the first time in my kind of movement. I'm a fast moving human, as most people around me know. So when I get stopped, that's something we stop and pay attention to. So I became a seeker, and I was one of those people that you'd find sitting in the back corner of a metaphysical bookstore with 42 books stacked up, and they'd kick me out when they turned the lights off because I was reading God knows who. All the way from Heidegger to Ramana Maharshi. It didn't matter to me. If I thought you had even a clue, I was probably trying to find it. And one day I heard Osho speak. And I went back to my office and I told him the next day, I said, I've heard someone, and I'm sure, I absolutely know that this person knows where the action is. He knows about the ego, and I know that's where I need to work. And I'll be flying off to India in 3 weeks. And now mind you, I'd never taken a week off, so this was a big surprise. And I remember the first question was, well, what happens if we go bankrupt? And in that moment, I said, well, I guess we'll have that experience because I'm going to India. So I went to India, and I spent the next, 3 years solidly, and probably the best part of the next 7 years in India. And in my path, Osho left the body, and there was another fellow who was an Advaitin out of the Nisargadatta Maharaj group. His name's Ramesh Balsekar. And Ramesh became a close friend and mentor. And it was in that time that everything shifted for me, an awakening event. And so Ramesh was kind enough to send me off into the American world and told me that in every culture, awakening has to grow on its own, and that the Western world had been leaning on the Indian world for way too long. So I got sent off. I got sent off back into this jungle, and so I felt that the place to actually do what I did was in the corporate world, because that's where I had come from. That's what I understood. There was an incredible, people don't know, but in the leadership space in the corporate world, there's an amazing resonance to consciousness work in the spiritual world. And I found that place, and that was where I lived for the next 10 years. And I retired a few years back. I live in Hawaii, and now I just do one-on-one mentoring for people that want to step into their own spiritual journey. So wrote a book along the way called Awakened Leadership. It's a journey book. It's all story. So if someone wants to read a story about the seeking journey, it's a fast read. It's a good airplane book.
It's an excellent book, and with profound understandings of what you're going to share with us today. So
yeah. So anyway, that's my history. Hope I didn't take too long. I apologize if I did.
That's all good, my friend. It's all good. So you said something that I found curious, and that is that in the corporate world, in certain echelons or circles, there's an openness or a readiness or resonance for non-dual or spiritual teachings. That seems like a surprise to a lot of, to myself. Can you share more? Why is that? And,
Sure. Sure. I think what happens is that our world is rendered, as you know, in duality. So it has a lot of metrics and concepts and thinking that goes on. So it's transacted in separation. There's just no doubt about that. You know that, and I know that. That's how the world. You're Satyen, I'm Alan. There's some assumption that Satyen and Alan are different things, not consciousness with its hands up our ass making us do this, which is really what's going on. But what I found out was that when you pointed to the actual arising of consciousness itself in any kind of world, and that people understood what that meant. So in my world, we all had been in the presence of great leaders. And so we understand, corporate people know what presence is. If you say to a corporate person, tell me about the time you were in the presence of a great leader, they will describe that. And when they describe that, then you can simply ask the question, do you think that's the ultimate destination for a great leader in business? And you know the answer to this, it's about 100%. There isn't an executive alive or a leader alive in the business world that doesn't go, if I sat in a room and that's the energy I was sitting in or I was exuding, that would be leadership to me. Now you can't put words around it because, sitting in the presence doesn't yield itself to words. But in leadership theory, actually, there is a whole kind of arc of what we move through, and all the theory and all of the deliveries are based on that. And at the very top of the arc sits this thing called the unitive, right? Now, nobody knows what the unitive is. They just know it's up there at the top. And so when you then tell somebody, well, no, what the unitive is, if you think of consciousness as a magnetic stream, that's what consciousness is. And at the end of that stream, you go sit with Nisargadatta, Ramana, one of your beautiful, folks that are one of the masters in your traditions, right? And the reason you do that is you're magnetized to sit with them. You can feel it, right? You know it. And that magnetization is just the pole of consciousness pulling everything towards it. And so the minute that you say that, everybody recognizes it. Oh yeah, you're right. If a great leader comes in, I'm going to go sit in the room I'm magnetized. I go sit in the room with that person. I want to figure out what's going on. I follow that person. It looks like it's a leadership movement, but actually it's just consciousness in motion, and I'm part of that consciousness. And so you begin to break those things down and talk about those things, and that's what allows you to have that conversation. And so really awakening in our world is rendering a set of pointers in the language that lives in any context. And so if you're with business people, you need to use business words. You and I use all sorts of spiritual words. I would never go into a business context and go, hey, I'm a teacher of non-duality. I would say something like, I'm a leadership resource and a mentor, because that's understood language. Then the conversation can go wherever it needs to go. Then what you count on is that in any given context, that by just simply following that path, eventually it'll explode itself, because you and I both know all there is consciousness, and it lives completely in everything. But you have to explode what you think is your own little world in order to see that there's only one world, and that happens by itself. So,
Yeah.
so the whole corporate venture is really dealing with people, taking them to presence, and then seeing them step into the rest of life and going, oh, holy shit, you know what? This is the same thing. And that's how spiritual movement looks in the corporate world. It's a little different than people getting on a plane and going to an ashram because they felt that pull from a spiritual place. It's the pull from the spiritual place, but living in a different house.
Yes.
That's all that's going on.
CEOs, business leaders, in my experience, in my opinion, are the ones that are making the most influence on this planet, more than politicians, more than our religious institutions, organizations, and such. What's the remedy for the craziness that we have going on right now? Because at a consciousness level, we're all arising out of the same experience, out of the same unity.
Correct.
And
Yep.
yet the structures of business, much of them are founded in we, us, against. I have to earn from you. I have to take away something from you. You have to take away something, competition, all of these things. How do we find a way to bring these together before we self-destruct?
So if you think that all of what you see rendered in front of you is just a story, right? Because what you and I do is we look out there and we extract, I look into a picture into Vancouver, Canada, and I see this beautiful Zen furniture and this amazing looking guy, and I'm speaking to him. And so I extract all of that and I go, oh, I'm talking to Satyen, and Satyen has this story, and this is how Satyen and Alan speak to each other. And so that's called cognition, but it's rendered into a story.
Yes.
And what people don't recognize is that story itself is a descent into identity until it's seen that that identity isn't who you are. And so when you look at almost anything, it's more dependent on who's looking, not what's happening. And you're right, there are those different places. So I often talk about the 3 levels of story, right? So the first level is the object level. And so if I can tell a story and all I'm doing is I go, hey, Satyen, I was down on the corner. I saw this taco shop. It was really crazy. This dog ran over and the guy made him a taco and gave it to him. Isn't that a funny story? And you go, wow, that's a really cool story, Alan. And we laugh and we giggle. And all I've done is I've taken this little object and I've given it to you. And now you're in receipt of that story. Well, then when you step up a level, now you start to use story to shift things. And so I might want to get a law passed, and I go out and get everybody I can. So the story is sitting this way. And if you get enough people over on this side, then the story starts to shift until it's this way, right? So that's what we call an influencing level of story. So story is an object, story is an influencer, right? And then the last one is story as an invitation. And if I tell you a story, right, and I invite you into that story, there you and I stand. You remember when you were a child and you'd read some fairy tale, and we've forgotten that our most powerful self is actually a child reading a fairy tale, because that child builds an entire world. And then he comes and he says, Dad, come step into this world with me. Now, most adults have a hard time with that because they've left that behind and thinks that's not too brilliant. And the child's actually offering the possibility of the highest level of unity and story, because you get to step in there. And when you do that with that child, it's not you and he, it's you're one thing and you're in the story. He's built a whole world for you to step into. And we all do that and can do that. So when you're working in the business world, it's a matter of understanding that when you can invite someone into that story, that's when presence magnetizes, right? So that's how you hook it in. Now, there are great leaders out there that have talked about that. One of my mentors is a fellow named Peter Drucker. And Peter Drucker was very famous as a kind of the entrepreneur's entrepreneur. But what Peter said that everybody ignores, his main thrust, the biggest thing he would say was that the world is moving so fast that governments and organizations are no longer going to be able to respond to the needs of that human movement, and that corporations are going to need to take that place. That was his biggest kind of thrust.
Well, that's where
so
we
there
are
is.
now.
That's right. That's right. So, and people are seeing, hey, wait a minute, when companies just do what they do, or we just lead in the way we lead, what we deliver is one thing, but never the other, which is actually the caring for humanity. And the only way to get that caring is to invite someone into the actual story that one stands in. So, I've worked for years I picked brand companies to work with. And the reason I did that was because they're so familiar with story. So I would go out and work with Vans or North Face or Nike. But I could walk in there, and when I talked about story, when I talked about living in a story, right? And you talk to Vans, off the wall, skater, ethos, and all of that, everybody gets what you're talking about. Because if you're a skater, you get living in the skater story, right? It's just part of being a skater.
Yes.
So those people, when you started to talk about how to elevate yourself relative to that story and how to move in a conscious way, that was immediately onboarded, because the big concern in most stories is to be authentic to the story. So, So here's the beauty of story. At the level of story, at invitation, right? That invitation level, and Joseph Campbell used to say this, that the more pure the story, the more it seeks to serve. Now, why is that? Because the boundaries of ego are broken down, the more pure the story gets. So, of course, you and I are in the story. I'm no longer seeking to serve Alan. I'm seeking to serve us, because it's us in the story. There is no Alan and Satyen. It's just the story. And so as that story of those boundaries dissolve, that story seeks to serve the entire invitation. And so when people get to see that and start to see that, then they're, they get concerned in a different way. So what I've been doing the last 2 weeks, which probably sounds like a silly thing to most people. I've had a CPA for 40 years, and so I still have a little bit of financial capability. And so I've got these SBA loans that are out there. And if a company gets an SBA loan, they can bring all of their people back, right? And they can have that loan forgiven, and everybody gets their payroll, which is a beautiful, beautiful idea, right?
Yes.
So I spent the last 2 weeks helping people apply to the SBA, right, to get these loans. Now, that doesn't sound like something that somebody who's into non-duality and spirituality is going to do, but that's the story that consciousness gave us, to live with each other as though there wasn't an each other, right? I don't know who those employees are, right? But the heart just calls you to stand in that, because it's a story that dissolves itself. If you get a loan and 100 people are now employed that were going to lose their job, something about that, really calls out certain activity. And so it's a story that invites one in. And the activity looks like, you're filing forms and putting numbers down, and you're doing this really highly, supposedly technical stuff, right? And really what you are is you're just simply uniting yourself with everybody else that's in that particular boat, right? In order to possibly achieve an outcome where we're all as one. And so that's, so all of these little silly things that look like separate exercises are actually invitations to non-separation.
Wow. So the motive, the intention, it's not even a motive intention, it's an arising coming from the unity that one is already living, expressed.
Sure. I mean, if you think about great leadership or great anything, it's actually having a sense that you're not separate. And then what wants to happen is really the ride that you take, because you're just strapped in. You're in the co-pilot seat. The pilot's flying the plane. So what arises in you? So why am I filing these SBA papers and doing all of that? I don't know. I have no earthly idea. Not one. All I know is companies needed help. The skill set in this body mind called Alan was able to help. And it all started, people started sending things. I started working with people, and pretty soon we were making filings. Now, I didn't know that. If you'd have talked to me 3 weeks ago and you'd have said, Alan, you're going to spend 10 days filing an insane load of papers with the SBA, I'd have said, you're drunk. That's not going to happen, right? And yet, 3 days later, guess what? That's what was happening. So that's just the simple availability to what wants to happen. That's not how most people think. They think, what do I need to do to be a leader? A very famous person that I wanted to write a blurb about my book said, I can't write a blurb about that book. And I said, why? And he said, well, when you talk about awakening, he said, that's not an attribute of any particular leader. And I said, yeah, that's the point. He goes, no, well, it can't be. That's not leadership. If the attribute isn't a part of the leader's ego, that's not leadership. That's how this particular famous person understood leadership. And I was actually trying to show that there is no ego, there's no need for any ego, and all that has to happen is that one lives the story that you already have in the back pocket without worrying about it, right? And that's great leadership.
Yes.
And in that context, if Satyen and Alan are on the same team, right, and Alan sees that Satyen's got the ball and he's going to make it happen, stepping back and letting that happen is great leadership. Not one word, nothing. It's great presence. Well, this is what wants to happen is Satyen's got the ball. Look at him go. So it's understanding, or it's just holding that possibility, which is where the separation that you talk about in the corporate world disappears.
Thank you. I'd like to step into the macro circumstance we've got here with COVID.
Sure.
And people's internal reactions. Everyone is unique. Everyone's having different experiences. From an evolutionary standpoint, you've been around the block. You've seen many theories. You've explored many worldviews. What do you feel is happening with our world, with us as a human civilization? And yeah, just how this whole experience is affecting mankind.
Okay, this will be different than you've probably heard before. So, whenever you talk about evolution, you make a presumption, or we all do when we talk about that. And what it does is it places humanity in the center of the universe, because there's some assumption that this is all happening for the evolution of humans. So that's about as self-absorbed as standing in the middle as an individual and saying, this is all about me. It's a group version of this is all about me. So I think, when I look at this, when we ask the question, what is consciousness itself? What does consciousness do? Well, consciousness reveals itself to itself. That's its entire function. That's what duality does. The whole reason duality is for that revelation to happen. And then it magnetizes. The way I was talking about it, magnetizes in those internals. And so when I look at what's going on, it actually, in my mind, is a call to the inside. Now it has both pieces. It has both pieces, because the more severe a circumstance, the more likely a human is to identify with who they are. You can understand that. In other words, like survival and things like that call out the individual ego. But at the same time, once that's exhausted, then there's the hero's journey, right? Someone goes, oh, it doesn't matter what I do. I'm still in this circumstance. Life is still happening the way it is. What's the next? There must be another place. And that's when the look inside happens. There's that old Zen story about the big, heavy-set Zen master, and his acolyte is sitting next to him. And as they're doing whatever their conversation is, the acolyte says, "Master, Master, I can't breathe." Right? And at that comment, the master elegantly lifts this entire massive body into the air, takes 2 steps over, and sits on the chest of the acolyte, and he says to him, "Breathe now." So in a way, the acolyte's looking to the outside as though breath happens from creating itself to the outside, and the master, what most people want to do is fix the outside so you can breathe. And that's what you're seeing going on right now. We're talking about conspiracies and this and that, but that's all moving the deck chairs on the Titanic. It's not looking at what's happening to the boat. So to me, if one can see that that's what's going on, the master is just sat on your chest, and the comment is, "Breathe now." So this is a call in a moment to go to the inside. It's what I see happening is an incredible humanization. All of a sudden we've been living in this information world for all of these years, and people have lost this kind of knack of caring for each other in some ways. And all of a sudden you see this caring starting to just pour out of people in every sector. So if one gets freaked out about what's happening, they go into how do I do what I need to do for me? Or there's this other story going on that says, there is no me, there is no you. How do I pull everybody into the boat together? And you see both of those happening. And so which of those 2 stories magnetizes consciousness? I can tell you, if you stand for a moment and just feel it, you'll feel the magnetization is to the story of humanization. And so to me, when I look at, that's what this is all about. This is just, consciousness has a habit when things are out of balance of stopping the world and saying it's going to be brought back into balance, as it were. Now, I don't even know what that means. I'm not saying that has a meaning. I'm just saying that seems to happen. And when I look at this, that's how I would look at this. I would say, when you look at the world, how you look at the world is actually held internally. It's seen from awareness, right, through the body, mind, and into duality and into consciousness. That story controls how everything is onboarded, held, and how service happens, and all activity in the world is from that place. Looking out there and pretending that one can reshuffle the cards, in my mind, that's a waste of time. By the way, that's not a very popular view.
Well, it's not a matter of popular or not. It's we're in this unique time, and I'm feeling this. I'm feeling this great calling of inwardness, this great calling of humanness, of care, of generosity, of kindness. But I'm also feeling it's not contrived. It's just ripening and arising to the surface, and it's becoming natural again.
Yeah. So if you think of the story identity, if all one has,
this is the piece I was going to ask you about. Okay, go ahead.
So if all one does is live in the story identity,
yes,
it's unanchored. It's unanchored, right? And you and I, you come from a tradition where the word when I'm going to say it. It's called Maya, right? It hides how it really works because it pretends that the connection isn't there, right? It pretends that the story is only happening here, and that's the only place it happens. So the true connection to stability, right? The true connection to stability is simply ignored. So the only way that stability can even show itself is when the rooting from the story identity to the true identity is alive and flowing. That's the only way it can happen. So when you take somebody to presence and you want somebody to stand in a room like an oak tree in the middle of a tsunami, right? Then that's that rootedness. You're trying to get them from story identity to real identity and establish that rootedness in between. That's what you're up to. And that's exactly what's going on. And that's what the call is. So, sometimes you see me playing politics and have comments about that. I reckon there is absolutely, that is just for no reason other than it's fun, because that story itself is by itself pretty much meaningless. In fact, it is meaningless. But if there is a rooting, when those stories are told in this conversation, there's an entirely different, so you might watch an NFL football game. Why do you do that? It's a pastime. It's fun. But there isn't anything in that moment other than just the fun of life, and it's happening. It's the warp and woof of whatever's going on. Now, if you're a football player, then that is the platform upon which you play that. If you're a politician, that's the platform. I'm a corporate guy, so my platform of finding rooting in true identity happens to live mainly in the corporate world and with people that came out of the same egg that this personality did. But that's the place that one needs to go in order to feel stability. So people will tell me, they'll say, but Alan, consciousness is always in motion. And I say, you're absolutely right. How can you find stability in motion? And I'll always say, there's a still point in motion. We all know that. So when you're a surfer on the face of a wave and you are one with the wave in the most amazing moment of just power and motion that one can imagine, an ocean wave. Like the ocean is clearly bigger and badder than any of us. We know that. Like you don't want to mess, like you don't go mess with an ocean wave because it's completely, it does not care about you or anything about it. It's a wave and it's going to do its wave thing. So being one with that wave, in the moment that one comes down the face of of that wave, there's a moment where you and the wave and everything is one thing. And the reason surfers go do that and mountain climbers find the peak of the mountain is they get a moment out of that establishes from the story to story identity to real identity. In other words, that moment of stillness. Now, when you start to unpack it with them, the spiritual journey says you don't have to ride 150 waves to find a nanosecond of stability. Actually, it lives within you at all times. So if you want to go ride the wave in your own ocean internally, we can do that. That's the seeking journey, and it's available. It lives. It's there. One can actually, move into that place. So those moments are what we would call free samples, right? That was Ramesh's. Yeah, people may know Ramesh Balsekar, who I was with, went to the London School of Economics and was the CEO of the Bank of India, and so he had this knack of calling spiritual things business stuff, and so he would make us all laugh. He'd go, "Oh yeah, you had a free sample, ain't that great?" And so nobody had ever said that in the spiritual world. That wasn't really a term we used. So but people understand that. Oh, a free sample. It's that moment. It's that moment of pureness that points to who you really are. All you have to do is step off of that and say, "Oh, I got it." It's not a moment. It's all moments. Right? It's just that one little step, and that's all the spiritual journey is.
Beautiful. When I've been with you, and I want to go down this true identity spiraling in. You've shared with me a few times around the principle or the ownership of belonging. That I belong or we belong, that's a starting spot of accessing the deeper self, the true self.
Yep.
Can you share about that?
Sure. So when I was in the ashram in the beginning, I remember I walked in and they said to me, "Hey, Alan, what are you here for?" And I didn't know any better, right? And I said, "Well, I heard you guys are doing enlightenment. Let's do that." And they said, "Well, how is it that," and they knew they had a weird fish, because here I am, this corporate dude straight off the boat, and I'm sitting in some maroon robes around all of these kind of, hippie freaks. So we knew they knew they were managing a strange quantity. And so I think they were pretty intelligent. They were like, this fellow's not going to step into the spiritual world and understand it. So let's let him go do what he needs to do. And eventually he might. So they said, how would you do that? And I said, it's no problem. I said, it's like everything else. You just tell me what I need to do. We'll put it on a list, 1 to whatever. And old Alan's going to go out there and knock them off one at a time. And when I'm done, it must be enlightened, right? Like any other to-do list, that must be how this works, right? Because that's all Alan could conceive. There was no other conception in Alan's mind about how things moved in consciousness. And so all we had was the one that we had. And so at one time I thought to myself, the next big move was, hey, you know what, if I can compile the theory of everything, and I would go to Osho's discourses and I'd come home and I would rework the entire theory of humankind and consciousness and movement in my mind. And I would add all the new stuff I would read or hear or whatever. And I would be up for hours every night, completely reworking it. Every night. I did that for years, every night, because there was somewhere inside me that said if I could put the separate components together, right? And I would listen to one person and the other, and I could say, oh, those don't agree, right? See, that's from the inside out. You see what I mean? I was working from the inside out. So there came a moment where that shifted and everything worked from the inside from the inside out rather than outside in. In that moment, guess what? Everybody agreed with everybody. Right? So when I talk to a corporate person and I say to them, I'm going to teach you how to belong in the room, right? All that is a meeting of someone where they are, recognizing that their conception is outside in. I can't tell them, I'm going to teach you how to be the room. That doesn't make any sense to what the hell does that mean, right? So when you're leading someone to the place that they're going to be, you have to meet them where they are, and your pointers have to, really relate to their experience. So me belonging in the room, they know the difference when they walk in a room and they don't feel like they belong in it. So over the years, people will watch me. I walk into the boardrooms of the biggest companies in the world, and if there's an empty seat, I sit down in it. Because somewhere in there, that belonging is happening, right? That story happens by itself. That's the place that everybody looks at and says, when somebody walks into the room and sits down next to the CEO of a $12 billion a year company, as though that was always his chair, I can feel the presence that exudes from that particular piece of activity. And so when you say, I'm going to teach you how to belong in the room, that's what you're communicating to them. What you're not communicating them to is that at the very deepest level, once again, you're just a puppet of consciousness, and you got walked into the room and sat in that seat, and you're just, like Nijinsky, I dance best when I'm not there. So, you ended up in that seat. If someone asked you to describe it, you'd give them some story that helped them along, but that's not really how it happened. Yes. But that's not the conversation that's ready yet. The conversation that's ready is, I can belong in the room. I'm in on that score. And so that's where that is. And so that's just a pointer. So the path of wisdom.
It's not belonging in the sense of an egoic claim or some type of personal affirmation or some type of, hey, I am one who belongs. It's not based on any of that outside identity story. It's based on it's based on the priority that all already is included, all already is already in place.
And then rendered into ego language as an invitation. That's all. Because if I said, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take you to a place where you dissolve. Now, how many people do you think are going to sign up for that one?
No, our tendency is to sign up and to be interested in things that make us more than what we currently are. Not less.
There you go. Yeah, it's exactly it. Exactly it.
How does one, like, we've experienced these states, these truths of being. Someone is watching this and going, well, what's the big why? Like, why would I want to experience myself as a nothingness? What would you say to that? And what's the value of this penetration of truth beyond the surface?
Well, it's not a value that probably marketable, sellable, or anything like that. But what most people, without realizing it, simply being a part of consciousness, what they want is the sense of permanent peace. Now, that gets a little confused because we've inherited this thing called bliss from the Eastern world, right? Which is much better rendered as peace because it's a much more, it's not screaming happiness and flying on a kite with Elon Musk or something. It really is. It's a much different thing. So, and that's where we're naturally headed, and that's what all consciousness. That's what that presence. That's what the unitive is perfect peace. And so, if that perfect peace is present, the states that you describe are moments of that perfect peace, right? The free samples, if you will. That moment happens, and the perfect peace is there. The only thing that then can or can't happen is if that moment closes off and the ego acquires that moment and then pretends that non-duality or non-separation or the free sample moment is something that happens within the ego world. Now you have the mixture of those two pieces, and that's where most of the confusion arises in the world as we see it today. So, consciousness, when the moment is ready, simply drops some body minds into that moment of perfect peace. In the East, they call that enlightenment. We a lot of times call it awakening or self-realization. I mean, there's all of those terms. But when we ask questions like what's the value, et cetera, if you think about it, that's an ego question. Yes. Value to who, right? So the reality is to say, look, you as consciousness are being magnetized to the absolute, unification, unitive, non-separation. That's where the pull is. And the question is, are you going to open up and let the pull happen? One of my favorites is Nisarga. You like Nisargadatta, so I know I can use, and he's one of my, having been around Ramesh and in that world, you can imagine it's easy for me to understand Nisargadatta. And so when he talks about what he did, what his master told him to do was go live at the level of what we call I am, which is just pure beingness. In other words, if you look at a human, the only thing a human knows is that they exist, and the rest of it's interpretation. And that's a Nisargadatta quote, by the way. But Nisargadatta made it real easy. He just said, hey, my master told me to go stay at that place. I am, and that's all I'm supposed to pay attention to. And that's what I did. And that's it. That's the entirety of when Nisargadatta was in his own seeking space, he wasn't this man that was generating all of these kinds of words that, and people were flying in to see him, and he had translators and all of that eventually. He was just a very simple guy, and all he did is he did what his master told him to do in a very unwavering and unceasing way. And the bottom fell out, and Nisargadatta became the Nisargadatta that you and I know. And so that's the simplicity, but it's already happening. The ego experience, when it's identified and thinks it's an autonomous author of its own experience, is actually a pull away from what consciousness is pulling you towards. If one claims the right to stand in that, if one simply cedes to the movement that's happening, then the ego space happens. You become whatever it is. You're a child. You're taught to live in society. You live the story identity, and there comes a point where the pull is now out of the ego space. If that pull is simply, allowed to move itself within a human being, that you're now on the spiritual journey, and that's where you're headed. That is the magnetization of consciousness. That's what's happening, and that's outside of what the payoff is, what the value is. As I say, the value is permanent peace, which I guess you and I could package up and sell. I'm not sure, how that would go, but because ultimately it's seen that the payoff has no value, because the payoff is pure authenticity and pure being. You are consciousness, and you recognize yourself as consciousness. That's all. So I don't know what the payoff, I don't know how to render that as a payoff that has value, but it is what consciousness is up to. So we can definitely say that.
Friends ask me who are in the spiritual realm, enlightenment circles, what is the ego? And is there a stage where there's a permanent realization, or are we constantly thrown around into identifying with the separative self or moving with the flow towards unitive consciousness? Is there a time like these, you talk about Nisargadatta or Osho, is there people who are permanently identified or non-identified with the surface arisings? And is that a possibility for us?
Yep. The answer to all those are yes. There's absolutely no doubt about that. The only difference is that the arisings that you see will always arise. And so you'll laugh when I tell you this. I had a gecko walk across my computer here, and it changed all of the stuff on my screen. So I thought, oh no, the gecko cut me off. So all that happens is that consciousness itself, if you want to look at it this way, is the perceptive container with which an all activity arises. What we do is we pick pieces out of the arising and identify with it, because consciousness itself is really available to wherever activity wants to go. So identification happens in consciousness just because consciousness follows the mind wanting to identify with specific things. And so so we come up with this idea that I am an autonomous author of my own existence, right? I do this, I do that. I'm worth billions of dollars and I did that. In my corporate world, that's the kind of thinking, or I ran a 9.400 meter and, that must be me. And so that's just the identification of separation that happens there. So the question is, when somebody does something, and there's a lot of ways to this. You see people take the psychedelic journey is an interesting way sometimes to get to it. People meditate. People do story work, which is kind of the Advaita. It's the old using your intellect as a thorn to pull out the thorns. Some people serve, right? There's the bhakti way where you're just simply in love. All of those things, if you think about it, what do they have in common? They dissolve boundaries, right? Yes. It doesn't matter which tradition you're in, there comes a moment where the boundaries drop, yes. Right? So I'm so in love with Satyen that I can't tell the difference between Satyen and I. I serve Satyen to such a degree that I'm serving myself and I can't tell the difference, right? They all end at the same place, which is the dissolution of you and the dissolution of me. And so then the question is there a state? Now that dissolution happens, but the activity continues. It doesn't, so nothing, all that happens is the identification is the glue, right? That glue is what goes away. The rest of it continues to happen. And so because the story identity is not linked to the true identity and it moves all over the place, we try to put the glue in there and make it, we're trying to get stability where there is none. That's all the ego is doing. That's what the ego is trying to do. Give me stability where stability doesn't live, right? So when stability itself raises its hand and says, this is where it is, those are moments that you see. And the question is, are there lives that are lived where the stability is in play at all times? That seems to be what you're asking me, right? Yes. And the answer to that is absolutely yes, right? So So when you see people start to talk about non-duality as though it lives inside of consciousness, you know they've gone off the road, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
consciousness lives inside the container,
Yes.
right? Of awareness. There's
Yes.
awareness and consciousness, the perfect still point and everything that arises out of the perfect still point. So it's just understanding that that really working in the outside is always a function of change, of chasing your tail, unless you use it to point to the inside. So the difference between knowledge and wisdom is, where do the same things point? Knowledge is the pretending that things can be solved on the outside in some particular way and that it leads somewhere spiritually. And pointers are taking exactly those same things and pointing them to the inside. That's the entire difference between those two paths.
But a drum roll.
Yeah. But the answer is yes, and I think the problem is that you just don't know in consciousness when awakening is going to occur. So, you know, a 14-year-old Ramana Maharshi is in a cave and awakens, right? And you're like, why? Right? And Ta Hui, who's this very famous Chinese fellow, you know, dies and awakens on his deathbed. You know, he was a spiritual teacher for 50 years, but that's how it happened. That was just simply how the moment, you know, called itself into play. So what happens to people is they say, wait, I've been on this path and nothing has happened for me, and so I'm getting despondent and disappointed. And what they don't see is that they're indulging their ego. That's not, you know, in other words, that's the ego who's raising its hand and saying, hey, nothing's happening here, brother. Let's get the hell out of here. Right?
Brother, this has been so illuminating and dropping in, like I always share when I'm with you. You always drop into the heart of truth. What's your in your heart to share to our friends today to round us off?
I'll tell you what it is. The more intense that life is, the bigger the opportunity. If one can turn to the inside with an intensity, the possibility is always the highest. Because the pull to the outside is so strong right now. You know, everybody wants to talk about, you know, the virus and where it's from and what it's creating and how, I mean, it's a huge conversation about that. So the pull to the outside right now is incredibly strong. And if in the middle of that pull, one can step to the inside, this is the moment. That's all I've got to say. This is the perfect moment for that particular step. And so if the words can be heard and someone can stop and say, oh, wow, you know what? In a very innocent and authentic way, I've been turning this last month or 2 months to the outside, but I hear what's being said and I'm going to take that and I'm now going to turn it to the inside. Then this is the moment for that, because the intensity that pulls one to the outside is the same intensity that pulls one to the inside. So right now, the superhighway to the inside is open. You just got to go across the freeway lanes, you know, because all the lanes are headed out, all the cars are headed out of town, and go catch one of those 2 or 3 cars that are headed back into town, because that's where the action is.
Brother, how can our friends find out about you and what you're up to? You can
go to alanshelton.com. I'm just in the midst of creating a mentorship program. It'll be released in June. I'm going to start to do, I call it a spiritual MBA. That's what I've labeled it. And so you'll see things about that. I will be doing it twice a month starting in June, question and answer. I call it the spiritual MBA question and answer period. You and I would call it satsang. But if I told the corporate people I was having satsang, they probably wouldn't know what I was talking about. They might think it was, you know, the meringue on a lemon meringue pie or something. So it's the spiritual Q&A about, it's a Q&A about spiritual MBA, and everybody's invited. I don't care who they are. Because what's different probably about what we're going to do in the Q&A is, you know, it's not a place for esoteric conversation. It's more like the one you and I had today. How does spirituality live in the true grittiness of what you see out there? So real questions, real things, hardcore, tangible, that's where spirituality happens. And that's the conversation that we want to have. And so anyone who wants to bring that tangible, here's what's happening, bomb, bomb, bomb. Those are the questions I think people will bring to that. And so we'll start that in June. And so, you know, everybody will see me. And if they want to have these conversations, they'll be available.
Thank you, my brother. I love you tremendously. I'm so grateful to have you in my life. And I'm looking forward to come back to the Big Island and playing with you and imbibing in your wisdom once again, my brother.
Okay. Much love.
Much love.
See everybody. Bye.